There is a pattern hidden inside church history. It appears in the 700s BC. It appears in the 1st century. It appears in 1740, in 1802, in 1806. It has appeared in nearly every major spiritual awakening in the Western world for 3,000 years, and almost no one has noticed it. Historians write around it. Theologians quote around it. Church biography focuses on the famous names, the preachers, the theologians, the reformers. But when you trace those names backward, when you ask who they were before the world knew them, where the fire started before it went public, you find the same answer, every time, without exception. Once you see this pattern, you will not be able to read church history the same way again. It is the 1720s. The American colonies are a century old. The original settlers, the Puritans, the Pilgrims, had crossed a dangerous ocean to build a new world shaped by their faith. They were people on fire. But fire, if it is not fed, goes cold. Picture a colonial church in 1730. A timber building, hard wooden pews, a high pulpit at the front, carved and elevated, designed to communicate authority. The minister stands behind it in his black coat, reading from a handwritten manuscript in a steady, careful voice. The congregation sits below him, still and silent. Farmers, tradespeople, their wives, their children. They have sat in these same pews their whole lives, and almost nothing has changed. The theology was still orthodox, but something essential had gone missing, the thing the words were supposed to point toward. The church of the 1730s had the form of faith without the fire. One minister of that era described his congregation as a valley full of dry bones. That was not a metaphor. That was a diagnosis. In colonial America, the church was the center of everything, where communities gathered, where children were educated, where the moral fabric of society was woven. If the church was hollow, the whole world it held together was slowly hollowing out. What broke through? Who started it? And how? If you had asked any educated person in 1730, they would have given you the same answer. Revival, if it came at all, would come through the established clergy, through the senior ministers, the denominational councils, the bishops with decades of experience. That is what everyone expected. That is not what happened. Before we go to 1740, I want to show you something older. There is a moment in 1 Samuel where God needs a king. The prophet Samuel has been sent to find him. He goes to a family with many sons, tall sons, strong sons, experienced sons, sons who look exactly like what a king should look like. Samuel sees the firstborn and thinks, surely this is the one. And God says no. He moves through every son in the room, 7 of them. No, 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 no. And then Samuel asks, are there any more? The father hesitates. Well, there is the youngest one. He is out in the field. We did not think to call him in. They send for him. A young man walks in from the fields, still smelling of sheep. And God says, that one, anoint him. David, the youngest son, the one who had not been invited to the gathering, the king who would define an entire nation for 3,000 years. This is not a coincidence. This is a pattern, and it does not end with David. The year is 1716. A boy walks through the gates of Yale College in New Haven, Connecticut. He is 13 years old. His name is Jonathan Edwards. Picture him for a moment. A teenage boy among young men, college buildings of stone and timber around him, the smell of wood smoke and river air. He is not there to visit. He is enrolled. He will graduate 4 years later as the top student in his class. He has no reputation to protect, no institution depending on him, no career to manage carefully. He is simply a young man alone in a library, reading everything he can find about God, filling journals with his thoughts, wrestling with questions most adults had long ago decided were settled. The ferocity of a mind that has not yet learned to be careful. He was 17 when he was converted, not in a ceremony, not at a planned event, alone, reading in his room, when something broke open inside him. He described looking up at the sky afterward and feeling that he was seeing light for the first time. A student, alone, changed. Years later, as a young minister in Northampton, Massachusetts, Edwards preached with that same intensity. No theatrics, no manipulation, just careful, relentless truth, aimed at farmers and tradespeople who had been sitting in church their whole lives without feeling it. And in 1734, something began to happen. People who had attended church for 30 years started weeping during sermons. Old enemies reconciled, households changed, and Edwards noticed something remarkable enough to document. It was the young people who moved first. He wrote it all down, a faithful narrative of the surprising work of God. He sent it to a minister in Boston. It was published. It crossed the Atlantic. Ministers in England and Scotland read it. And a student at Oxford University read it. A teenager entered a university. A student was converted alone in his room. A young minister sparked the first American revival. The document that spread the fire was written for an academic audience. The pattern has begun. We just have not named it yet. 3,000 miles away, at almost the same time, a young man with no money and no connections was making his way to Oxford University. What happened to him there would change the Western world. His name was George Whitefield. He grew up poor in Gloucester, England. His father died a wage. He was 2. His mother ran a PU. B2S. Irvive. He had no social standing, no family connectee. No obvious path to one of the world's great universities. But he made it to Oxford, not as a full scholar, but as a servitor. A student who paid his tuition by running errands for wealthier students, carrying their bags, cleaning their rooms, sitting below them in the dining hall, the lowest rank in the university. One morning, a student named Charles Wesley invited him to breakfast. Whitefield went. At that breakfast, he was introduced to a small group that met in the evenings, reading scripture together, praying, fasting, visiting prisoners in the local jail. The other students at Oxford mocked them openly. They called the group the Holy Club. They meant it as a slur. The group's leader was Charles's older brother, John Wesley. Its newest and youngest member was George Whitefield. It was in that room, a student Bible study inside a university dormitory, surrounded by young men being ridiculed by their peers, that George Whitefield was converted. Two of the most significant religious movements of the 18th century, the Great Awakening and the Methodist movement, both trace their origin to the same student group. A small room at Oxford, young men, a breakfast invitation, no bishops present, no church council, no institutional authority. There it is again. God did not begin with the established church. God began with students. Whitefield arrived in America in 1739, 25 years old. Over the next year, he traveled 5,000 miles on horseback, preached more than 300 times, and addressed crowds that no building on the continent could hold. Picture Philadelphia, 1739. An outdoor field near the city center. Thousands of people packed together, merchants, laborers, sailors, farmers who had ridden in from the countryside. No stage, no amplification. Just a young man standing in the open air, preaching. In that crowd stood Benjamin Franklin, not a believer. but the most precisely observing mind in the colonies. He walked backward through the crowd, slowly, counting heads and calculating area, until Whitefield's voice faded into inaudibility. Then he did the arithmetic. 30,000 people could hear George Whitefield simultaneously in the open air. Franklin went home and printed Whitefield's sermons. He could not explain what he had witnessed. He could only document it. The most skeptical man in America, watching a 25-year-old former Oxford student reshape a civilization. In October 1740, Whitefield preached on the New Haven Green to enormous crowds, then inside the chapel at Yale College. And then, as was his custom, he moved on to the next town. But what he left behind did not move on. The following spring, a campus revival broke out at Yale. Prayer meetings formed in dormitory rooms. Students who had been spiritually indifferent were converted. Eyewitnesses described the change as permanent, not an emotion that faded, but a transformation that reshaped lives. And from that revival, 2 young men emerged whose influence would outlast everything around them. The first was Samuel Hopkins. He arrived at Yale indifferent to faith. He left carrying a theology that would reshape American Christianity and become one of the earliest Christian voices against the slave trade, decades before abolition was politically safe. The Yale revival made him. He spent the rest of his life remaking American moral theology. There it is again, a student, changed, sent out to change the world. The second student is the one I want you to sit with. His name was David Brainerd. He arrived at Yale as part of the same revival. Young, passionate, intellectually sharp, and, as sometimes happens with young men who are newly on fire, not always wise. During the controversy surrounding the revival, Brainerd made a sharp remark about one of Yale's faculty members. He said the man had no more spiritual insight than a chair, undiplomatic, unkind. And in the hierarchical culture of 1740s academia, it was fatal. Yale expelled him, permanently. He never received his degree. No established church would ordain a man without one. Every door the institution could close was closed. So he went where no institution had gone. Picture the New Jersey wilderness in 1743. Dense forest, no roads, small Native American communities scattered across rivers and valleys, communities the established church had not reached and was not trying to reach. David Brainerd rode into that wilderness on a horse, with almost no money, speaking languages he was still learning, sleeping in rough shelters. He was 25 years old. He labored in those forests for 4 years. He kept a journal, not for publication, not for an audience, but because writing was how he prayed. He wrote about his loneliness, his failures, his recurring despair, his tuberculosis, slowly destroying his lungs while he refused to stop. He wrote about the small Native American community being transformed around him, people who stopped drinking, reconciled with their enemies, built something new from almost nothing. He died in 1747, 29 years old, expelled, degreeless, unknown, buried in a small grave in Northampton, in the home of Jonathan Edwards, who had cared for him in his final weeks. And then his journal was published. A young minister in England named William Carey read it. He could not put it down. He became the father of the modern missionary movement, the first Protestant missionary to India, the man who created the template for every overseas mission agency that followed. He said it was Brainerd's journal that sent him. A scholar named Henry Martin read it and went to India and Persia, translating the New Testament into languages no missionary had attempted. A young man in the 20th century named Jim Elliot read it, copied passages into his own journal, and went to Ecuador, where he was killed by the people he had come to serve. His own journal, published after his death, sent another generation. The expelled Yale student, no degree, no position, no denomination. The most influential missionary in American history, not through the institution, despite it. God did not use the powerful. He produced them, through students who were young enough and unestablished enough to go where no one else would. Was this unique to the 1740s? It was not. 50 years later, Yale had drifted again. By 1795, open skepticism had taken root in the student body. The new president, Timothy Dwight, the grandson of Jonathan Edwards, found almost no professing Christians among the students. He preached carefully and systematically into the skepticism. By 1802, a revival broke out. A third of the student body was converted. The Second Great Awakening had ignited. At Yale. Again. Through students. Again. History was repeating, and it was not finished. In 1806, 5 college students at Williams College in Massachusetts were gathered for an outdoor prayer meeting when a summer storm rolled in. They sheltered under a haystack at the edge of a field. They kept praying. And in that haystack, in the rain, they committed their lives to overseas missionary work. Those 5 students founded the first 6 North American foreign mission agencies. The entire modern overseas missionary movement from this continent traces its origin to 5 college students and a rainstorm. The revival historian J. Edwin Orr spent his career documenting this. His conclusion, drawn from studying every major awakening in the Western Church for 3 centuries, was direct. Young people in student prayer movements have been at the forefront of almost every great awakening. Not occasionally, almost every one. This pattern did not begin in 1740. When God needed a prophet to speak to Israel, he called Samuel in the middle of the night, as a child, sleeping in the temple. The high priest who should have heard first was lying in his room, his eyes too dim to see in the dark. God walked past him and spoke to the child. When God chose a prophet to speak to an entire generation, he chose Jeremiah, and Jeremiah's first response was, "I am only a youth." God interrupted him. "Do not say that. I knew you before you were born. I appointed you before you had a name. Your youth is not the problem. Your youth is the point." When God sent Samuel to anoint Israel's next king, he passed over every impressive son in the room, 7 of them. And then Samuel asked, "Is there anyone else?" The father said, "Well, there is the youngest. He is out in the fields. We did not call him in. They sent for him." David walked in from the fields, and God said, "That one." The Great Awakening did not invent this. It confirmed what Scripture had been saying for centuries. God begins with the young, not despite their inexperience, but because of it. Because they have not yet learned what is impossible. Because they will go where the established will not. Because they still believe. The First Great Awakening did not begin through a council of bishops. It began through a 13-year-old at Yale and a student Bible study in an Oxford dormitory. The Second Great Awakening was ignited at the same campus, 50 years later, by a new generation of students. The modern missionary movement launched from under a haystack in a rainstorm. At every point where the pattern could have broken, it did not. If you are a student watching this, your youth is not something you need to overcome before God can use you. It is not a waiting room. You are not in rehearsal. History does not say the Great Awakening happened, and then the young people got involved. History says the young people moved first, and then the Great Awakening happened. We are building a full series tracing this pattern from the 1st century to the present. Every major awakening in Western Christian history traced back to its roots. We are going to name the students, trace the pattern, and let the evidence speak. Do you know a student right now whose faith is extraordinary? A young person who seems to carry something you cannot quite explain? Tag them in the comments, because the next awakening is not going to begin in a conference center. It will begin in a dorm room, a campus Bible study, a prayer meeting that no one outside the building knows about yet. 3,000 years of scripture, 300 years of history. One pattern. God goes to the fields first. He calls the one they forgot to invite in. He always has. And somewhere right now, in a room you and I have not heard of yet, He is doing it again.